In the spring of 1991, a woman walked out of her apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City and did not come back. She was 84 years old. She had lived in that apartment, one of three she owned on the same floor of the same building, for decades. The apartment was filled with things she loved: French antique furniture, paintings by Renoir and Monet, dolls in glass cases, a collection of Japanese art that museum curators had been requesting to see for years. The rugs were Persian. The ceilings were high. The view looked out over Central Park, where the trees were just beginning to come into leaf in that particular pale green that only exists for 2 weeks in April, before the full summer wait arrives. She left for a hospital stay that was supposed to be temporary. She never returned to any of her homes. She lived the last 20 years of her life in a series of hospital rooms, by choice, and she paid for those rooms herself, and she decorated them herself with the things she loved, and she was, by every account of the people who actually knew her, content. The apartment on Fifth Avenue sat empty for 20 years, its lights on timers, its rooms exactly as she had left them, the dolls in their cases, the Renoir on the wall, the furniture arranged for a life that was no longer being lived inside it. Her name was Huguette Clark. She was, at the time of her death in 2011, one of the wealthiest people in the United States. The inheritor of a fortune built on copper mines in Montana. A fortune so vast that its origins sat at the founding of the American industrial age. A fortune that had bought senators and built mansions and financed an art collection that would eventually be dispersed to museums across the country. She was also, in the final years of her life, the subject of a legal battle conducted by people who had not seen her in decades, who claimed she was mentally incompetent, who challenged the gifts she had made to the people she loved, and who ultimately received, in the settlement that followed her death, the money she had explicitly chosen not to leave them. This is the story of what was done to Huguette Clark. It is a story about loneliness and love and the particular vulnerability of an old woman who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. It is a story about what happens when a family decides that a relative's money matters more than her wishes. And it is a story that the people who fought it in courtrooms and conference rooms and hospital corridors would prefer, even now, to remain in the files where most of it began. Before we go further into this story, drop your city in the comments below. And if these stories matter to you, the ones that get buried in legal settlements and sealed records and the quiet agreements of people who had too much to lose, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing. It tells the algorithm this kind of history deserves to be found. To understand Huguette Clark, you have to understand where she came from. And where she came from was a world so remote from ordinary American life that it might as well have been a different country entirely. Her father was William Andrews Clark. If that name means nothing to you, it is because history has been unkind to men whose wealth was enormous and whose methods were brutal, and whose legacy was eventually eclipsed by the more famous robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts. But in his time, William Andrews Clark was among the richest men in the United States, and his story is one of the most extraordinary examples of self-made fortune in American history. Clark was born in Pennsylvania in 1839, the son of a farmer. He moved west, taught school, tried his hand at various enterprises, and eventually arrived in Montana in the years after the Civil War, when the territory was just beginning to reveal the scale of what lay beneath its mountains. He got into banking. He got into mining. He understood with the particular clarity of a man who had nothing and therefore had everything to gain, that the copper beneath the Montana earth was not simply copper. It was the wiring of the modern world. As electricity spread through American cities, as telegraphs became telephones, as industrial machinery required the conducting metal that only copper could provide at scale, the men who controlled the copper controlled something closer to the circulatory system of the American economy than any mere mineral deposit. Clark controlled the copper. He fought for it literally and legally and politically against other men who wanted it just as badly. He bribed the Montana state legislature to send him to the United States Senate, bribed it so brazenly that the Senate itself, in 1900, voted to expel him for corruption, an event so rare in American political history that it remains notable more than a century later. He resigned before the expulsion could be formalized, returned to Montana, won a special election through further manipulation, and served his term anyway. He was, by the standards of the Gilded Age, not unusual in his methods. He was simply more conspicuous about it than most. By the time he was in his 60s, Clark was worth somewhere between $200 and $300 million, a figure that, adjusted for the value of money in the early 20th century, represents a fortune of staggering scale by any contemporary measure. He had copper mines, he had banks, he had railroads, he had real estate in New York and California and Montana. He had an art collection assembled in Europe over decades of travel, paintings and sculptures and decorative objects that would eventually form the basis of the Corcoran Gallery's collection in Washington. He had, in short, everything that the Gilded Age offered to men who were ruthless enough and intelligent enough and lucky enough to arrive at the right place at the right moment in American industrial history. He also had, late in life, a second family. Clark's first wife, Catherine, had died in 1893. He had several children from that first marriage, adults by the time the 20th century began. In 1901, when he was 62 years old, he secretly married a woman named Anna LaChapelle. Anna was 23. She had been, depending on which account you believe, either his ward or the daughter of a miner he knew, and their relationship before the marriage was the subject of considerable scandal when it became public. Clark and Anna had two daughters. The first was Andre, born in 1902. The second was Huguette, born in 1906. Huguette Clark entered the world as the daughter of one of the richest men in America and a mother 39 years younger than her father. She was born into a life of almost incomprehensible privilege: apartments in New York, a chateau in France, estates in California and Connecticut, servants and tutors and travel and the finest of everything the early 20th century's wealthy class could provide. She was also born into a family that was, in certain essential ways, already fractured. The older children from Clark's first marriage had no particular warmth for the second family, and the scandal of William Clark's late-life marriage had given the family a complicated public reputation that would follow Huguette long after her father was gone. Clark died in 1925 when Huguette was 18. He left an estate of roughly $75 million. A significant portion of it went to his second family, to Anna and to the two daughters. Huguette's portion, invested and managed over the following decades, would grow through the middle of the 20th century into something considerably larger. But the money was, in a sense, the least interesting thing about what William Clark left behind. What he left behind, more consequentially, was a daughter who had grown up in a world so sealed from ordinary experience that she had never developed, had never been required to develop, the ordinary social armor that most people acquire through the friction of ordinary life. Huguette Clark was, by every account, a genuinely gifted artist. She was shy. She was warm in private. She had a sense of humor that surprised the people who encountered it for the first time. She was also, from very early in her adult life, retreating. The retreat was not sudden. It was gradual, the way these things always are. Huguette had been briefly married in 1928, at 22, to a man named William MacDonald Gower. The marriage lasted less than a year. Neither party ever discussed it publicly, and Huguette almost never mentioned it for the rest of her long life. She had no children. She remained close to her mother, Anna, who lived until 1963, and whose death left Huguette at 56, essentially alone in a family sense. The older Clark children from the first marriage were not close to her. The extended family was distant. She had friends, or had had them, a goddaughter named Wanda, a few others from the social world of early 20th century New York that she had briefly occupied before beginning to withdraw from it. By the 1950s, the withdrawal was already significant. She had stopped attending social events. She had stopped granting interviews. She had become a figure known primarily through the size of her holdings and the opacity of her private life. She owned the apartment on Fifth Avenue, actually 3 adjoining apartments on the 8th floor of the Bellosguardo building, and she owned a vast estate in Santa Barbara, California, called Bellosguardo, which sat on 23 acres above the Pacific and had been one of her father's properties, and she owned a summer cottage in New Canaan, Connecticut. She maintained all 3 properties, paid the staff to care for them, and spent less and less time in any of them as the decades passed. What she did instead was paint and play music and tend to her dolls. The dolls require a moment of explanation because they have been, in the telling of Huguette Clark's story, used in ways that are not entirely fair to the woman whose story they belong to. Huguette Clark collected Japanese dolls and collected French fashion dolls, and in the latter part of her life, commissioned custom-made dolls representing characters from her own imagination. She wrote stories for them. She built miniature environments for them. She spent money on them. This has been presented, in some accounts of her life, as evidence of eccentricity, as a symptom of arrested development, as one of the markers that her family and their lawyers would eventually use to suggest she was not fully competent to manage her own affairs. What it actually was is simpler and less dramatic. It was the hobby of a woman who had been an artist all her life and who, in her later years, channeled her creative energy into a medium that she found absorbing, and that gave her pleasure. It was nobody's business, and it would have remained nobody's business if the woman who indulged it had been worth a great deal less. By the time she left her Fifth Avenue apartment in 1991 and checked into New York Hospital for what was supposed to be treatment of a skin condition, Huguette Clark was in her mid-80s, and her fortune had grown to somewhere in the range of $500 million. The exact figure is difficult to establish because her financial affairs were complex and her investments were managed through structures that were not fully transparent to anyone outside the small circle of people she trusted. But $500 million is a reasonable estimate for the period, and it would continue to grow. She was not committed to the hospital. She was not declared incompetent. She simply found that she preferred the hospital room to her apartment, and she stayed. She paid her own way. She stayed for 20 years. The people who knew Huguette Clark in those hospital years described someone who was, by any reasonable measure, not the person her family would later claim she was. Her nurse was a woman named Hadassah Perry, who had been assigned to Huguette's care and who became, over the years, something closer to a companion and a friend. Huguette taught her to paint. She remembered Hadassah's children's birthdays. She was funny. She was sharp. She had opinions about things and expressed them. She was, in the clinical language that would later be applied to her mental state, oriented to time and place and person. She knew who she was. She knew what she owned. She knew what she wanted to do with it. What she wanted to do with it had become, by the final decade of her life, a fairly clear set of intentions. She wanted to give money to the people who had actually been present in her life, to Hadassah, who had cared for her, to her accountant, Wallace Bach, who had managed her affairs for years, to her attorney, Irving Kamsler, to her goddaughter Wanda, and to a small number of other individuals who had maintained actual relationships with her across the decades of her withdrawal. She wanted to leave her Santa Barbara estate, Bellosguardo, to a foundation that would open it as a cultural center. She wanted to give her art to museums, and she did give her art to museums, including a Renoir that went to the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts, named for her father. She did not want to leave the bulk of her fortune to the Clark relatives who had played no role in her life. This is the fact at the center of everything that followed. Huguette Clark did not want to leave her money to people she did not know. She had updated her will to reflect this. She had made gifts during her lifetime to the people she valued. She had been, in the management of her own affairs, quite deliberate about where she wanted her money to go. The Clark relatives, a group of individuals who were, in terms of actual relationship, quite distant from Huguette, some of them descendants of the children from William Clark's first marriage, people who had not seen Huguette in decades and in some cases had never met her at all, had a different view. The legal machinery began to move in 2010, the year before Huguette's death. The New York Attorney General's office opened an investigation into the people around Huguette, her nurse, her attorney, her accountant, following concerns raised by hospital staff and by the Clark relatives who had begun to organize around the question of her estate. The investigation focused on whether the people closest to Huguette had exerted undue influence over an elderly and allegedly vulnerable woman to direct her gifts toward themselves and away from her family. The phrase undue influence is a legal term of art. It refers in the law of wills and trusts and gifts to a situation where someone in a position of trust over an elderly or incapacitated person uses that position to bend the person's testamentary choices toward their own benefit. It is, in the right circumstances, a legitimate legal concern. Elderly people with large fortunes are sometimes manipulated by the people around them. It happens. The law provides a remedy for it. The question, in Huguette's case, was whether the concern was legitimate or whether it was a legal vehicle for a set of relatives who had no meaningful relationship with her to assert a claim over money she had deliberately chosen not to leave them. The internal records of the investigation, the depositions, the medical evaluations, the correspondence, tell a story that is more complicated than either side's preferred version. Huguette's nurse had received gifts that were, by any normal measure, extraordinarily large. Hadassah Perry received, over the course of her relationship with Huguette, gifts totaling in the millions of dollars: cash, property, money for her children's education. Her attorney and accountant received significant gifts as well. These were real numbers. They were documented. They were the basis of the legal argument that Huguette had been manipulated. What the legal argument required setting aside was a different set of facts. Huguette Clark had been making substantial gifts to the people she valued for decades, long before anyone could claim she was incapacitated. She had been, by the accounts of physicians who evaluated her, mentally competent to make those gifts. She had expressed consistently and repeatedly that she wanted those gifts made and that she did not want her money going to relatives she did not know. And the relatives who were asserting that she had been manipulated were, in the most straightforward reading of the situation, people who stood to benefit financially from a finding that her gifts had been inappropriate. There's a word for that conflict of interest. There are actually several words. None of them appear in the legal filings in the language of accusation, because the legal filings were written by the relatives' attorneys, who had their own interests to consider. The investigation resulted in a settlement, negotiated after Huguette's death in May 2011. The settlement was not a criminal conviction. It was not a finding of wrongdoing in the formal sense. It was a negotiated resolution of competing claims over a large estate, reached by parties with lawyers, and it distributed money in ways that reflected the relative legal leverage of those parties rather than necessarily the wishes of the woman whose money it had been. Hadassah Perry returned approximately $5 million of the gifts she had received. The attorney and accountant faced legal consequences of their own. The Clark relatives, who had not been mentioned in Huguette's final will, received a settlement from the estate totaling around $34 million, money that Huguette had explicitly chosen not to leave them. The Bellosguardo estate went partly to a foundation, as Huguette had wished, and partly to other purposes. The art was distributed to museums, largely as she had intended. The Fifth Avenue apartments, empty for 20 years, were sold. The dolls went to auction. The medical record of Huguette Clark's final years is a document worth reading carefully, because it is the foundation on which the claim that she was incompetent was built, and because what it actually shows is considerably more ambiguous than the claim required it to be. Huguette was evaluated by physicians on multiple occasions in the years before her death. The evaluations were conducted in the context of the legal proceedings and were therefore not neutral assessments. The people commissioning them had interests in the outcomes they produced. What the evaluations generally found was a woman who was elderly and who had some cognitive slowing, as people in their late 90s and early hundreds do, but who was oriented to her circumstances and capable of expressing consistent preferences. She knew what she owned. She knew who she wanted to give it to. She knew the names of her relatives, including the ones she had chosen not to include in her will, and she was able to explain, when asked, why she had made that choice. This is not the portrait of a woman who was incompetent to manage her own affairs. It is the portrait of a woman who was old, and who had, over the course of a long life, made choices that the people around her found inconvenient, and who was being subjected to legal scrutiny precisely because those choices had financial consequences for people who had not been present for her life but who were very present for its ending. The physicians who treated her at the hospital, the people who actually knew her day to day, described her consistently and over many years as someone whose mental state was intact. She was, they said, private. She was, they said, shy. She was, they said, in some ways unusual. She preferred the hospital to her apartments. She did not want visitors who were not part of her small trusted circle. she found comfort in a contained and predictable environment. These things may be unusual. They are not incompetence. There is a distinction that the legal proceedings tended to collapse that needs to be maintained clearly. The distinction between eccentricity and incapacity. A person can prefer a hospital room to a Fifth Avenue apartment. A person can collect dolls at 90. A person can choose not to see relatives who have not been part of their life. A person can give large gifts to a nurse who has spent decades in their company. None of these things, individually or together, constitute evidence that the person is unable to understand and direct their own affairs. What they constitute, in the context of an enormous fortune and a set of disappointed relatives, is a legal opportunity, and that opportunity was taken. The story of Huguette Clark's life before the hospital years, the long decades of withdrawal, the maintained properties, the private world she built inside her apartment and then her hospital room, raises a question that does not have a simple answer. Was she happy? The question matters because it has been answered, in most accounts of her life, in one of two ways. The first way is the one favored by the people who wanted her declared incompetent. She was a damaged, isolated woman who had been failed by everyone around her and who spent her final decades in a state of diminished existence, prey to the manipulation of greedy caregivers. The second way is the one favored by the people who actually spent time with her. She was a woman who had discovered, after a long life of extraordinary privilege and its attendant complications, a way of living that suited her, and who was content in it. The people who say the second thing are the people who were there. The people who say the first thing, with the most institutional force behind them, were not. What the record suggests is something more textured than either version. Huguette Clark was, by any ordinary measure, a lonely woman. She had no children. She had outlived the people closest to her. She had, through the decades of her withdrawal, sacrificed the ordinary social world in exchange for a private one that was entirely on her own terms. Whether that exchange represents happiness or damage depends on a set of values that are not universal, and the imposition of those values on her choices by relatives who had not known her, by legal proceedings conducted after it was too late for her to fully participate in them, is its own kind of violation. She chose the hospital. She chose Hadassah. She chose the dolls and the painting and the small circle of people she trusted. She chose all of it, repeatedly, over 20 years, with a consistency that argues against the claim that she did not know what she was choosing. The choice she did not get to make entirely was what happened to her money after she was gone. The Santa Barbara estate, Bellosguardo, still exists. It sits on its 23 acres above the Pacific, the main house a Mediterranean villa built in the 1930s, surrounded by gardens that have been maintained through the years since Huguette stopped visiting, and through the legal proceedings that followed her death, and through the ongoing work of the foundation that now controls it. The foundation has been working toward opening the property as a cultural center, as Huguette wished. The work has been slow, as these things are. The property is extraordinary. The views are what they always were. The Fifth Avenue apartments were sold after her death. The buyer renovated them. The rooms where the Renoir hung and the dolls stood in their cases, and the furniture sat arranged for a life that ended in 1991, are now different rooms. The building is still there. The floor is still the 8th. The windows still look over Central Park. The copper mines in Montana that made the fortune are long since exhausted. The companies that owned them dissolved or absorbed into larger industrial entities over the century that followed William Clark's death. The money that came from them passed through Huguette's hands, and from her hands into the hands of museums and nurses and legal settlements, and the Clark relatives who had never met her. And the passage of it was not entirely as she intended. The dolls, the Japanese dolls and the French fashion dolls, and the custom-commissioned figures that she had written stories for and built worlds around and spent 50 years in the company of, were sold at Christie's in 2014. They went for more than $1 million in total. The buyers were collectors. The dolls went to different houses, different rooms, different glass cases. The stories Huguette had written for them are not recorded. They went with her. There are things about Huguette Clark's life that the legal record does not capture. There's the fact that she continued to paint in her hospital room into her late 90s. The paintings were given to the people she cared about. Some of them were given to Hadassah, who received them as gifts in the same spirit that Huguette gave everything, not as a transaction, but as an expression of a relationship that was real to her, that had the weight and texture of the closest thing to family she had in the last decades of her life. There is the fact that she learned, late in life, to use the telephone in a way that gave her genuine pleasure. She made calls. She talked. She maintained relationships through conversation when she was no longer able or willing to maintain them through physical presence. The people who received those calls described someone who was curious, who was engaged, who asked questions about their lives and remembered the answers the next time she called. There is the fact that she had, for most of her adult life, given money away with a generosity that was not strategic and not performative. She gave to hospitals, she gave to arts organizations, she gave to individuals who had done work she valued. She did this quietly, without press releases, without the cultivation of a philanthropic reputation that might have served her interests in the legal proceedings that followed her death. She gave because she had more than she needed and because giving was, for her, an expression of care that she found easier than the kinds of physical proximity that most people use to express the same thing. There is the fact that her relationship with Hadassah Perry, whatever its financial dimensions, was by every account a genuine human relationship. Hadassah was present. She was consistent. She was someone Huguette trusted in a life where trust was not easily given. The gifts she received were large. They were also, from Huguette's perspective, proportionate to what she was receiving. Not medical care in the transactional sense, but the daily company of someone who actually saw her, who treated her as a person and not as an estate to be managed. The legal system has a framework for evaluating gifts from elderly wealthy people to their caregivers, and that framework is legitimately necessary because manipulation of that kind does happen. But the framework, applied to Huguette, required characterizing as suspect something that the record suggests was, in its essentials, genuine. It required treating as a symptom of manipulation choices that had been consistent across decades and that the woman making them had been able to explain and defend. It required, in the end, substituting the judgment of people who had not been present for the judgment of a person who had. The question the Huguette Clark story keeps returning to is one of the oldest questions in the law of inheritance, and it does not have a clean answer. When does a person's right to dispose of their own property end and the interests of their family begin? The law has various answers to this question, depending on the jurisdiction and the circumstances. In general, competent adults are free to leave their money to whomever they choose. The law does not require that wealth pass along bloodlines. The law does not require that relatives who have been absent from a person's life be rewarded for that absence at the person's death. What the law does require is that the person making the choices be competent to make them. And competence, in the context of an enormous estate and a set of disappointed relatives with good attorneys, is a concept that can be interrogated with a degree of pressure that the concept does not always survive. Huguette Clark was not declared legally incompetent. That finding was never made. The settlement that distributed her estate in ways she had not fully intended was not based on a finding that she had been incompetent. It was based on a negotiated resolution of legal uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that exists whenever an elderly person has made large gifts to caregivers, whenever a will has been recently revised, whenever the people who benefited from that will have their own vulnerabilities to legal attack. The settlement happened because litigation is expensive and uncertain, and because the people who had received Huguette's gifts were not in a position to fight indefinitely against an opposition with essentially unlimited resources and the institutional backing of the state attorney general's office. It happened because the alternatives to settlement were worse. It did not happen because anyone proved that Huguette had been manipulated. It happened because the legal system, confronted with an 80-year-old woman's choices and a group of distant relatives who disagreed with those choices, found a way to split the difference. The difference it split was not abstract. It was $34 million to relatives who had not known her. It was Hadassah returning $5 million of gifts that Huguette had chosen to give her. It was a resolution that satisfied the legal system's interest in resolution, and satisfied the relative's interest in a share of the estate, and satisfied almost nobody else. Huguette Clark died on May 24, 2011, at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City. She was 104 years old. She had lived through 2 world wars and the Depression and the entire arc of the American century. She had been born when Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House, and she died when Barack Obama was. She had outlived everyone who had known her as a young woman, everyone who had known her father, everyone from the world she had grown up in and eventually retreated from. She died in a hospital room that she had, in her own estimation, chosen and made her own, attended by the people she had chosen, surrounded by the things she had chosen to have near her. The obituaries described her fortune. They described the empty mansions. They described the dolls. Some of them described the legal proceedings, though those proceedings were still in progress at the time of her death, and the full picture of what they would produce was not yet known. Very few of them described the person, the painter, the woman who called people on the telephone and remembered the details of their lives, the woman who had found a way to live that satisfied her in circumstances that the people writing about her found difficult to understand. She was buried in the Clark family mausoleum in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, alongside her mother and her sister Andre, who had died of meningitis in 1919 at the age of 17. Andre's death, when Huguette was 12 years old, had been one of the formative losses of her life, a loss that people who knew her well believe she never entirely recovered from, though the ways in which grief shapes a life are rarely as simple as the accounts that try to trace them. The mausoleum is made of marble. It is, like everything associated with the Clark fortune, very large and very solid and designed to last. It does not announce itself. It sits in the cemetery the way Huguette preferred to sit in her hospital room, enclosed, private, on its own terms. The legal proceedings that followed her death took several years to resolve. The settlement, reached in 2013, distributed the estate roughly as follows. Museums received art as Huguette had intended. The Bellosguardo Foundation received the Santa Barbara estate, as she had intended. Charitable organizations received significant gifts, as she had intended. Her nurse, her attorney, and her accountant were required to return portions of what they had received and face legal consequences in addition to those returns. And the Clark relatives, the distant heirs who had not been included in her will, received approximately $34 million. The $34 million is the number that defines the settlement for those who knew Huguette and for those who have studied the case. It is the number that represents the gap between what she wanted and what happened. It is the number that answers the question of what the legal system does when a wealthy old woman's wishes conflict with the interests of people who have the resources and the standing to challenge those wishes. The Attorney General's investigation, which had framed itself as a protection of a vulnerable elderly person from manipulation by her caregivers, produced as its most significant outcome a transfer of $34 million to a group of people who had not been in Huguette's life. Whether that outcome constitutes protection of a vulnerable person is a question that reasonable people, looking at the same record, have answered differently. The people who cared for Huguette Clark in her final years. Whatever their faults, whatever the scale of the gifts they received, whatever the legitimate questions that can be raised about the financial dimensions of those relationships, were present. They were there. They were the people she called on the telephone and painted pictures for, and trusted with the details of her daily life when she had retreated so far from the world that daily life was all she had left. The people who received $34 million from her estate were not present. They had not been present for decades. Some of them had never met her. This is the central injustice of the Huguette Clark story, not the size of the gifts to her nurse, not the revisions to the will, not even the legal proceedings themselves, which were conducted by people who had legitimate roles in the process and who believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they were acting in Huguette's interests. The injustice is simpler. It is that a woman who knew what she wanted, who had expressed what she wanted consistently and over many years, and in legal documents prepared with full legal assistance, did not entirely get what she wanted. The money she had chosen not to leave to people she did not know went, in part, to those people. The judgment she had made about who deserved her gratitude was overruled, not by a finding that her judgment was impaired, but by a legal process that treated the possibility of impairment as sufficient to redistribute what she had carefully directed. She was right. She knew what she was doing, and it did not matter enough. The mansion in Santa Barbara still stands above the Pacific. The Bellosguardo Foundation is working to open it to the public and to make it the cultural center that Huguette wanted it to be. The work takes time and money, and the particular kind of patience that institutions require when they are trying to honor a complicated legacy. The house is there. The gardens are maintained. The view over the water is what it was when Huguette's father built the original structure on the bluff above the city. The Fifth Avenue apartments are renovated and occupied. The new inhabitants know the history of the rooms they live in, or they do not. Either way, the rooms are different now. The dolls are scattered. Christie's cataloged them carefully before the auction. Each one documented, its provenance established, its relationship to Huguette's collection recorded. The catalog is a kind of history, the only surviving record of the miniature world she built over 50 years in apartments and hospital rooms. The dolls themselves are in other people's collections now, objects of interest and of value to people who know about them and people who do not, moved from the hands that acquired them and cared for them into the general circulation of things that outlast the people who love them. The copper mines are long since gone. The money that came from them has passed through so many hands and taken so many forms that the original substance of it, the metal from the Montana earth, the labor of the men who pulled it out, the political corruption that secured the claims, the industrial machinery that processed it, is entirely abstract now, entirely converted into the legal tender of estates and settlements and foundation endowments and museum acquisitions and auction receipts. William Andrews Clark, who built the fortune and who bribed his way to a Senate seat and who married a woman 39 years younger than himself and who died before he saw what would happen to the younger daughter he left behind, is buried in the same woodlawn mausoleum as the daughter who outlived him by 86 years. He could not have imagined, even with the comprehensive acquisitiveness that defined his character, that the most interesting thing about the fortune he built would not be its size, or its source, or its political ramifications, but the woman it fell to and the small, private, entirely singular life she built inside it. Huguette Clark did not want to be famous. She did not want to be studied. She did not want her dolls cataloged and auctioned, and her choices subjected to legal scrutiny and her relationships characterized as manipulation. She wanted to paint and to call people on the telephone and to live in her hospital room with Hadassah and to give her money to the people and institutions she valued and to be left alone. She got most of those things. For most of her long life, she got most of them. The part she did not get is the part that gets remembered. The story of Huguette Clark is not finally a story about money. It is a story about what we owe the people who have chosen to live on their own terms. It is a story about the mechanisms the law provides for overriding those terms when the financial stakes are high enough. It is a story about what happens when a person's eccentricity, her preference for a hospital over a mansion, her dolls, her telephone calls, her carefully maintained distance from a world she found overwhelming and is reframed by people with an interest in the reframing as evidence of incapacity. And it is a story about a particular kind of loneliness that wealth does not prevent and does not cure. Huguette Clark was born into one of the richest families in America. She died attended by a nurse she had come to love and by a small circle of people she trusted. Between those two events stretched 104 years of a life that was, in its essential texture, the life of someone who had found the world difficult and who had managed that difficulty by creating inside the vast resources available to her a smaller and more manageable world of her own. There is nothing pathological about that. There is nothing that requires correction. There is nothing that justifies the intervention of distant relatives and state attorneys, general and legal proceedings conducted in conference rooms that Huguette never entered, producing settlements that distributed her property in ways she had not chosen. What there is $34 million. And the dolls at Christie's. And the foundation working to open Bellosguardo to the visitors who will come one day to stand on the bluff above the Pacific and look at the view that Huguette's father paid for, and that Huguette loved, and that Huguette stopped visiting decades before she died because she had found something she preferred. And somewhere in the legal record, in the depositions and the medical evaluations and the Attorney General's investigation files and the settlement agreements, is the voice of a woman who knew what she wanted and said so, consistently, over many years, and who was overruled by people who had not been there. She was 104 years old. She had outlived everyone who had known her as a young woman. She had outlived her sister and her mother and her father, and the world they had all lived in together. She had outlived, very nearly, the legal system's ability to touch her. Very nearly. The mansion is still there. The view is what it always was. And the woman who looked at it last, in whatever year she stopped coming, left no account of what she was thinking when she turned away. She kept that, at least, entirely to herself. The people who challenged Huguette Clark's competency in the final years of her life were not, in every case, acting from simple greed. Some of them believed what they said. Some of the Clark relatives who filed legal challenges genuinely believed that an old woman living alone in a hospital room surrounded by dolls, giving millions of dollars to a nurse, was someone who needed protection. The belief was not unreasonable on its face. It is the kind of belief that social workers and elder care advocates and public guardians hold about elderly people in unusual circumstances all the time. And sometimes that belief is correct. Sometimes elderly people are manipulated. Sometimes the people closest to them do take advantage. The question in Huguette's case was never whether this happens. It does. The question was whether it had happened here with this specific woman in these specific circumstances, producing these specific choices. And the answer the evidence supports, not the answer the legal settlement produced, but the answer the evidence supports, and is considerably more ambiguous than the legal framing required it to be. What the legal framing required was a story in which Huguette was a victim. A vulnerable, isolated woman, her judgment clouded by age and dependency, preyed upon by the people she had placed her trust in. This story had the advantage of being emotionally legible. It fit into a framework that the law recognizes and that the public understands. It made the intervention comprehensible. What it required, setting aside, was the alternative story, the one in which Huguette was not a victim, but an agent, a woman who had made unusual choices and who knew she was making them. A woman who had, over 100 years of life, developed a clear sense of what she valued and what she did not, and who had the legal and financial means to act on that sense, and who had done so. A woman who had chosen, with full knowledge of what she was choosing, to spend her final years in a hospital room with a nurse she trusted, and to distribute her money to the people who had been present for her life, and to leave the people who had not been present out of it. These two stories cannot both be true. The legal system, confronted with both of them, chose the first one, not because the evidence compelled it, because the first story was more useful. There is a woman who worked at Beth Israel Hospital during the years Huguette Clark lived there who has described, in interviews given years after Huguette's death, what it was like to see her in that environment. She was not describing an incapacitated woman. She was describing someone who was alert to her surroundings, who had preferences and expressed them, who knew the names of the people around her and asked about them with genuine interest. She was describing someone who was, in the ordinary sense of the word, present. Present in the room, present in the conversation, present in the relationship between herself and the people who cared for her. The hospital was not, in this account, a place of diminishment. It was a place where Huguette had arranged her life in a way that suited her. She had her paintings on the walls and her dolls in their places and her telephone and her art supplies and Hadassah nearby. And she had, in this constrained and carefully managed environment, a degree of control over her daily existence that she had probably not felt in the larger and more chaotic world she had retreated from. This is not a tragic portrait. This is not the portrait of someone who needed to be rescued. It is the portrait of an old woman who had found a way to be comfortable, and who was comfortable, and who was then subjected to legal proceedings that she was too old and too tired to fully fight, proceedings that were nominally about protecting her, but that were in their practical effects about the money she had accumulated over a long lifetime and the question of who would receive it. The proceedings produced a result. The result was a settlement. The settlement was called a resolution. And in the language of legal resolution, the matter of Huguette Clark's estate was closed. What was not closed and cannot be closed is the question of what she would have said about it if she had been able to say. Certain. The Clark relatives who received $34 million in the settlement have not, in the years since, said much publicly about the case or about Huguette. This is understandable. The legal proceedings that produced the settlement were not, for any of the participants, a comfortable public narrative to claim. The relatives were arguing, in essence, that a woman they had not known had been manipulated into not leaving them money she had never indicated she intended to leave them. This is a difficult position to occupy publicly, even when the legal system ultimately provides a degree of validation for it. The nurse, Hadassah Perry, has been similarly quiet. She returned a portion of what she had received. She has said, in statements made through legal representatives, that her relationship with Huguette was genuine and that the gifts she received were given freely by someone who was fully aware of what she was doing. This account is consistent with the medical record, with the testimony of the physicians who treated Huguette, and with the accounts of others who knew them both. Whether it is consistent with the legal system's final determination is a different question, and the answer to that question is embedded in a settlement document whose terms are not fully public. The attorneys who managed Huguette's affairs in her final years faced their own legal consequences, separate from the estate settlement. The accountant, Wallace Bach, was convicted of charges related to his handling of Huguette's finances and sentenced to prison. This was the clearest finding of actual wrongdoing to emerge from the entire legal process, a finding that concerned the attorney's conduct, not Huguette's competence, and that said something specific about the professional behavior of someone she had trusted with her affairs. What the conviction of her attorney does not prove is that Huguette did not know what she was doing when she made the choices she made. Those are separate questions. A person can have been represented by a dishonest attorney and still have been fully competent to direct her own affairs. The conflation of these things, the misconduct of those around her and the competence of Huguette herself, was one of the legal proceedings' least examined moves. She deserved better professional representation than she received. That is clear. But deserving better representation is not the same as being unable to make her own decisions. And the legal system treated those two things as though they were connected in ways that the evidence does not fully support. 100 years from now, the Huguette Clark story will be a footnote in the history of American inheritance law and a slightly longer footnote in the social history of the Gilded Age fortunes and their dispersal. Her father's name will be remembered by historians of Montana and of the United States Senate and of the copper industry. Huguette herself, the painter, the recluse, the woman with the dolls in the hospital room, and the nurse she taught to paint, will be a curiosity, a figure whose life resists easy summary and whose choices resist the narratives that biography most naturally imposes. What she actually was, stripped of the legal drama and the fortune and the empty mansions and the auction of the dolls, was a person who had found a way to live that suited her. A person who was shy and who was kind and who was funny in private and who loved Japanese art and French fashion dolls and the work of painting and the texture of relationships conducted at the distance she found comfortable. A person who had been formed by loss, her sister's death, her father's early disappearance from her daily life, in the sense that fathers of his generation were rarely present in any meaningful way, the failed marriage that she never discussed, the friends and family members she outlived over the course of a century, and who had organized her life around what remained when those losses were subtracted. What remained was art. What remained was beauty. What remained was a small circle of people she trusted, tended with the care and the gifts of someone who understood that attention, expressed through money as well as through time, was its own kind of love. She did not ask to be understood. She asked to be left alone. The answer she got in the end was complicated. The Bellosguardo Foundation is still working. The Santa Barbara estate is still there. One day, if the foundation's plans come to fruition, visitors will be able to walk through the gardens on the bluff above the Pacific and look at the view that Huguette loved and stopped visiting and wanted preserved. On that day, they will be standing in a place that exists because she wanted it to exist, managed by an institution she created for that purpose, open to people she will never meet. That is something. It is not everything she wanted, but it is something that will last in a world where most of what people want does not. She was 104 years old. The mansion is still there. The view over the Pacific is what it always was. And Huguette Clark, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with the things she loved, was not in the end entirely left alone. But she was, in the ways that mattered most to her, herself, entirely, stubbornly, quietly herself. That the legal system could not take from her. That nobody could take. The history of great American fortunes is, at its core, a history of what money does to the people who hold it and to the people who want it. William Andrews Clark's fortune did what most Gilded Age fortunes did in the first generation. It concentrated power, built institutions, bought influence, and sustained a standard of living that insulated its holders from the ordinary conditions of American life in ways both comfortable and distorting. In the second generation, it fragmented, as those fortunes do. The older Clark children from the first marriage received their shares and lived their lives. The younger daughters, Andre and Huguette, received theirs, and then Andre died, and Huguette was left with everything. What Huguette did with everything was, by the standards of the Gilded Age inheritors she might have emulated, eccentric. She did not found institutions with her name on the door. She did not seek influence. She did not cultivate the philanthropic reputation that would have given her a public identity, and perhaps more importantly, a public record that the legal system would have found more legible when the time came to evaluate her choices. She gave quietly and personally, and without the kind of documentation that protects large private gifts from later legal challenge. This was a mistake in a narrow tactical sense, but it was not a mistake in the sense that people who knew her would recognize. It was consistent with who she was. It was how she had always operated. She gave to people, not to causes. She gave because she wanted to, not because she wanted credit for it, and she gave without the thought that one day her gifts would be examined by attorneys and investigators and a New York State Attorney General who had an obligation to ensure that the elderly and the wealthy were not being exploited. She was not, in the estimation of the people who were with her, being exploited. She was being herself. The legal system does not have a framework for being yourself. It has a framework for competence, for undue influence, for the protection of vulnerable adults, for the orderly transfer of wealth according to documented intent. These frameworks are necessary and, in most circumstances, protective. In Huguette's circumstances, they became the vehicle through which a woman's expressed wishes were partially overridden by the expressed wishes of people who had not shared her life. The last painting Huguette Clark made is not known. There was no announcement of it, no final work identified and preserved and labeled. She painted in her hospital room, in the same spirit she had always painted, for herself, for the people she cared about, as an expression of a sensibility that the circumstances of her life had never entirely been able to suppress. Somewhere in someone's possession is a painting that Huguette made near the end of her life. It may be in Hadassah's house. It may be in the possession of someone else she gave it to. It may have been sold as part of the estate's dispersal. It is, wherever it is, a small painting made by an old woman in a hospital room, made for the pleasure of making it and for the pleasure of giving it to someone she cared about. That is not a diminished life. That is a life. It has the same dignity as any other life, regardless of the apartments on Fifth Avenue that sat empty and the Renoir on the wall and the copper mines in Montana that made everything possible. The life inside it was hers. She painted. She called people on the telephone. She sat in her hospital room and looked at the things she had arranged around her and was, by the accounts of the people who were there, content. Content is not a dramatic word. It does not make good copy. It does not explain why the apartment sat empty for 20 years, or why the relatives hired attorneys, or why the dolls eventually went to Christie's. But it is the word that the evidence supports, applied to a woman who outlived the entire world she had been born into and who built, inside the resources she had, a smaller world that suited her. She was 104 years old when it ended. She was painting near the end. She was herself near the end. The legal system got its settlement. The relatives got their $34 million. The foundation got Bellosguardo. The museums got the art. The dolls went to Christie's. And Huguette Clark, who wanted to be left alone with the things and people she loved, left behind a story that will be told as long as there are people who are interested in what money does and what it cannot do, and what happens when someone tries to live inside an extraordinary fortune, an ordinary private life. She kept her own counsel for 100 years. She was right to. The world that wanted a piece of her got pieces of her estate. It did not get her. She held that to the end quietly, in her hospital room, surrounded by the things she had chosen, attended by the people she trusted, painting pictures nobody outside her circle would ever see. That nobody could take. That was hers. The estate sale at Christie's in 2014 was, in its way, the final chapter of a story that had been told in auctions and legal filings and hospital records and empty apartments for 100 years. The catalog described the dolls with the precision that auction houses bring to objects of value. Each one was measured and photographed and assigned an estimate. The bidders who came for them came from the world of serious collectors, people who understood what they were acquiring, who had the resources to compete for them, who would take them home to their own collections and their own glass cases and their own carefully maintained environments. They did not know the stories Huguette had written for them. Nobody knew those stories. They had lived in her imagination, in the private world she had built inside the hospital room. In the conversations she had with them that were not conversations in the ordinary sense, but were nonetheless real in the way that all creative engagement with the things we love is real. Real in its effects on the person doing it, real in the pleasure it generates, real in the way it organizes time and gives texture to days that would otherwise be simply days. The dolls went to their new owners for prices that reflected their provenance, not just what they were, but who had owned them, who had commissioned some of them, who had written stories for them that nobody would ever read. They sold well. They sold for more than their intrinsic value. They sold, in other words, as Huguette Clark items, which meant they sold as artifacts of a story rather than as objects in themselves. This is what happens to the possessions of the famous wealthy when their estates are dispersed. They become artifacts. They stop being the things the person used and loved and stop being part of the life that was organized around them and become instead objects in the market for significant provenance, valuable because of what they are attached to rather than what they are. The Renoir that hung in the Fifth Avenue apartment became a Clark Renoir. The dolls became Clark dolls. The furniture became Clark furniture. The person who owned them and who organized her life around them and who gave them meaning through that organization became, in the process, a label. She would have hated this. She would have found it absurd. She had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid exactly this reduction, to be Huguette rather than a Clark, to be a person rather than a fortune, to have the things she loved remain the things she loved rather than become evidence in a legal proceeding or lots in an auction catalog. She failed at this in the end, which is to say she succeeded at it for 100 years, and then the machinery of estates and settlements and dispersals did what that machinery always does. It distributed, it cataloged, it assigned values and moved things to their new places and filed the paperwork that closes an estate. The paperwork is filed, the estate is closed, the dolls are in their new cases, and somewhere in the legal record, in the depositions and the medical evaluations and the letters between attorneys, is the voice of a woman saying in various ways and over many years what she wanted. She said it clearly. She said it consistently. She said it in the presence of lawyers and physicians and hospital staff and the people she trusted. She said, "This is mine, and I know what I want to do with it, and I want to be left alone." The answer she got was complicated, but the voice is there. in the record, saying what she said, clear and consistent, and entirely her own. There are questions the Huguette Clark story cannot answer, and the inability to answer them is itself part of the story. We do not know, with the kind of certainty that the legal proceedings required, whether the people she trusted had manipulated her. The settlement did not establish this. The settlement established that certain financial relationships were legally problematic, and that the estate's distribution could be contested, and that a negotiated resolution was preferable to a trial whose outcome was uncertain for all parties. What it did not establish is the thing that mattered most to the people who actually knew Huguette, whether she had been herself, fully herself, in the choices she made. The physicians who evaluated her said she had. The hospital staff who observed her daily said she had. The people she called on the telephone, who heard her voice and spoke with her about their lives and hers, said she had. Against this testimony stood the fact of her isolation, the size of the gifts, the revision of the wills, the relative youth of the people she had chosen to benefit, the relative oldness and distance of the people she had chosen not to benefit. In a court of law, these facts would have been weighed against each other by people who had not known Huguette. The settlement meant that weighing never happened, which means the question remains open in the way that questions left unanswered by legal processes remain open. Permanently, because the process that would have closed them was never completed. The open question is this: did Huguette Clark, in the last 2 decades of her life, make the choices she would have made in full possession of her faculties and her freedom? Or were those choices shaped, in ways she could not fully perceive, by the dependencies and the isolation that her long withdrawal had created? The answer the evidence supports, for those willing to read it carefully, is the first one. She made her choices. They were her choices. They were consistent with who she had always been and what she had always valued, and they reflected a judgment about the people in her life that was neither impaired nor imposed. The legal system's partial disagreement with this reading was not based on evidence that compelled a different answer. It was based on the legal system's understandable institutional interest in resolving a dispute, and on the leverage that the Clark relatives' legal position gave them, and on the vulnerabilities of the people around Huguette who had received her gifts and who were not in a position to defend those gifts indefinitely. She was overruled. She was right. These things are both true, and they are both part of the record, and they both deserve to be said clearly, because the alternative, by you accepting the legal settlement as a finding about Huguette's mental state or the legitimacy of her choices, would be a misreading of what the settlement actually was. The settlement was a resolution. It was not a truth. What remains of Huguette Clark, finally, is not the money. The money has been dispersed. It is in museum endowments and foundation accounts, and the bank accounts of relatives and former nurses, and the proceeds of an auction at Christie's. It has done what money does. It has moved. What remains is the story, and the story, told carefully, is the story of a woman who lived 100 years in full possession of herself, who built a life that was genuinely her own inside circumstances, that could have overwhelmed her, who gave her love and her money to the people who had actually been present for that life, and who was, in the end, subjected to legal proceedings that treated her choices as symptoms rather than as decisions. She was a person. She made choices. The choices were hers. The legal system, confronted with those choices and with the people who disagreed with them, produced a settlement that split the difference between what she wanted and what the people she had not wanted received. The split did not reflect the truth of who she was or the legitimacy of what she had chosen. It reflected the mechanics of legal negotiation applied to an estate of sufficient size that all parties had something to lose from litigation and something to gain from resolution. This is how the law works. It works this way with ordinary estates and extraordinary ones. It works this way with people who are fully present and people who are impaired and people who are somewhere in between. It processes disputes. It produces outcomes. The outcomes are not always just. They are always final. Huguette Clark's outcome was final in 2013 when the settlement was signed. She had been dead for 2 years by then. She had no voice in the room where the settlement was negotiated. She had had a voice, a clear and consistent one, for 20 years before her death, and that voice had said what it said. The settlement said something different. The settlement was signed. The painting she made last is somewhere. The last phone call she made was to someone who loved her, in the way she understood love, attentive, present, real. The last thing she looked at in her hospital room was something she had chosen to have near her. The last day of her life was, by every account of the people who were there, a day in which she was herself. That is what she asked for, not fame, not a legacy, not a foundation named for her, or a gallery, or a public accounting of her significance. She asked to be left alone with the things she loved and the people she trusted. She asked to live her life on her own terms for as long as she had a life to live. For 100 years, she did. The last 2 years of it, the legal proceedings, the settlement negotiations, the dispersal of the estate, were not on her terms. They were on the law's terms, and the law's terms in this case were not equal to the person they were applied to. Huguette Clark was worth more than the law gave her credit for. She knew it. And in the hospital room on the day she died, surrounded by the things she had chosen and attended by the people she trusted, she was right. She was always right. The mansion is still there. The view is what it always was. She was 104 years old, and she was herself until the end. That, finally, is the whole story.